One of the things that duality, probability, and possibility suggest are that within relationship with any object, you have the entire possibility field on every dimension. And so you have an object, let's say a human being, let's say a table, an object. And within the probability and possibility field of this object, you have every possible relationship on every dimension in which the object is relevant. And so as human beings, one of the more significant dimensions is the emotional dimension, where the meter of our emotions registers the relationship with a given object. So, for example, you take this cube here, and if you associate this cube with repeated traumas, meaning you're subjected to endless horror, and the visual correlation of that horror is this cube. Well, the visual of a cube correlated with profound traumatic horror, be that induced by repeated needling, electric shock, whatever, will create a biological association between the image and the trauma. The same is true with joy. If you experience euphoric visions, dreams, extreme physical pleasure, and register the shape of this cube, when the image of this cube flashes before your eyes, it will evoke the correlation of the history of experiences with the cube, which, depending on the intensity of the history, may or may not override the present. In other words, the present may have a +5 charge on an emotional level, and the past association may have a +200, and what this means is that as you experience the involuntary exposure, the spontaneous exposure to the object, in whatever format it was correlated, it could be in the format of touch, meaning one of the reasons I discovered I had allergies to grasses was the correlation between repeated trauma as the family dog chased me through grass at a stage of pollination. And in that tall grass, not being able to escape the helplessness, the repeated exposure to that scent, participated in the inducement of an allergic reaction when smelling the pollen of grasses as an adult, because the charge wasn't reduced. Meaning that 2-year-old boy falling down over and over again never got helped. And in the dissociation of partitioning off arenas of trauma, because, for example, when a child cries and is shaken violently or shouted at to shut up, the trauma doesn't, of course, vanish. What happens is a flip gets switched to keep the body alive. The emotion gets dissociated from, and you have a large emotional charge frozen in time in a dissociated state, both within the body and within the conscious mind. And the child adapts to the dominant curators of the environment, in this case, the parents that don't want to hear the screaming. And in that context, the charge remains of hyperactivity and an allergic charge to physiologically a high stress charge that's then invoked by the scent of pollen. So in that context, we can develop the entire spectrum of emotional states on the entire spectrum of intensity. So you have emotional states, you have positive or expansive states and negative or contracting states. And then you have the vertical continuum, the intensity. And then you have a variety of different ways to correlate physical memory and psychological memory with a given object. You can be experiencing intense physical pain while watching the object. You can experience intense physical pain while smelling the object. You can experience, a very neutral state where there's no intensity and it's neither positive and negative. And this creates a very neutral relationship with the object. And we have to respect just means to look and keep looking. We have to honor, allow ourselves to be changed. We have to respect and honor the charges that we are dealing with in association with a given object. It's very much like charging a battery. If you charge the biological memory and you keep charging it, you give it charges, and you don't diffuse the charge, you've got a high voltage pocket of energy that if you touch it, it may shock you and even shock you into dissociation. And so it becomes intelligent. If you're an electrician and you see that you're charging an area repeatedly, it becomes intelligent to, first of all, try and harness that energy to diffuse and run off the charge. And it also is intelligent to respect the charge, to understand it, and to match it with with goals that need that amount of electricity, with purposes that require that kind of fuel. And you can certainly pair two, if you create an intense meltdown, you can pair two batteries. You can just take two powerful batteries and charge them in opposite sides, and if the batteries don't explode, they will rapidly drain each other because they're meeting in the middle, creating an enormous resistance pattern that will melt and lead to the explosion of many batteries or objects, like the wire connecting them will get very hot and things of that nature. That's why we have fuses, so that doesn't start a fire. And so this is, again, the object around which there will be a charge of some kind if it's and when we're dealing in the possibility field, we have the full possibility of positive and negative charge at the full range of intensity. And And this is part of the human condition. Meaning, if an object exists, and we are in the dualistic paradigm that is the human condition, which includes having an emotional meter, our feelings, our energy perceived through the lens of whatever it is. We could call it a biological lens. We could call it a psychological heart lens. We could call it, a conscious lens. But in order to have feelings, we have to experience energy through the lens, through the observing and measuring device that produces feelings. And every human being has feelings, unless they have been partitioned, meaning unless the consciousness has been banished from the emotional state to survive in a sociopathic environment. Everyone has feelings. And even in a sociopathic state, there is generally some degree of feelings. There may not be grief, there may not be tenderness, there may not be the full range of emotion, but there is some strong fear, strong anger, or, association to the emotional body, to the emotional self. There's an awareness. Even in a state of great detachment, one might feel wonder at the profound state of dissociation. So, when an object exists in proximity to a human being, the possibility field says that we can have the entire spectrum of emotion, and let's say feelings, because emotions are internalized. Let's say you can have the entire spectrum of feelings, and you can have the entire spectrum of intensity. And it could even be emotions, because in order to generate certain intense feelings with an object, like to have you literally faint at the sight of a table, one might have to put someone in an isolation tank in which there's nothing visual but a table. So they're deprived of all sensory activity. And what that means is they'll fixate on the one thing they can see. So if you put someone in an isolation chamber and you put a table there, they will hunger, their senses will hunger for the table. It will be brought into extreme memory through the contrast of something and nothing. If in that context then you expose the person to extraordinary suffering, the impact of the table will be significantly higher than if you just saw the table as one of 30 items in the room. But a part of your mind will alert you that you are in threat. If you exited the environment in a state of trauma and you return 30 years later and you look around, you see that table, your mind is going to say, watch out, this table has been connected with a life-threatening incident. It may not be safe because you haven't resolved the life-threatening force that you experienced before. And in that way, or do the exact same thing in a positive exploration where you experience, sensory deprivation and a table, and you're exposed to profound and extraordinary love in relation to that object. Now, of course, if we're touching, this is one of the reasons why the emotion of love transcends the feeling of love when you grow old with someone you are in love with. Because when you grow old with someone you are in love with, the literally millions of split seconds in which you're associating your beloved with this individual stays with the body as it ages, to a point where you can be with a frail, wrinkled, small, unsavourily smelling individual in their 90s and be absolutely clear in a conscious and emotional state that they are the most beautiful person and the most beautiful object on the planet. And that you'd happily give up everything for this person, and maybe even your own life, because of the intensity of the correlation between that visage, that smell, that tactile presence, and millions upon millions of micro moments of seeing the beauty, of admiring, of enjoying. And you've created this association. And as you've grown older together, as the body changes, the association stays constant. And so you have the great joy of curating an association between the younger body and the older body, between the younger individual, between the past and the present. And so in the high positive range of an object's association, in this case, the object being the human body, you have an intensity charge that is so high and of such a positive nature so many times that you literally override strong drives within the psyche, where you can have an old man or an old woman who might still feel the original pleasant charge of eroticism around a pert young body, but comparing it to the 2 million point charge that they've cultivated and grown together, it's like water. Yeah, it's fun. You look beautiful. But I'll pick my partner every time because of the curated charge that's built over time. And this is the nature of the mathematics of an object existing within a dualistic paradigm. Now, the full potential of the object within a dualistic paradigm will express itself in every dimension. So I'm focusing on the emotional dimension because this is for human beings, and we have an emotional relationship of some nature. It could be 0.0001 negative charge or positive charge that because there's so much going on, we don't notice it. But if you have fine enough instrumentation, if you shift any aspect of the environment and are able to zoom in on the shift, there will be a measurable shift that is in the senses and that affects the emotion. And it's not always just about the object itself. For example, you can be in very peaceful states and any change whatsoever creates a disturbance. If the unknown is associated with trauma, like for example, if you were born in a traumatic environment, you're born, that's the biggest unknown. It's like you're going into the world of the unknown and you're immediately abused. This predisposes you on a psychological and physical level to have terror of entering any vast new domain that is unknown. Because you entered a vast new terrain that was unknown as an infant being born out of the womb, and you were immediately surrounded by shocking beeps and chemicals rushing through and this going on, and lifted up and done this, then your thing was clipped, and there was no sense of where am I emotionally, what's going on. It's just absolutely overwhelming and terrifying. And that will define the template for the most intense emotional charge around relating with the unknown, with an unknown environment. So why is this interesting? What are some of the ways that this is relevant? Well, if we understand that we're going to look at an object in its masculine and feminine expression, that every object has a masculine and feminine expression, that every object has a positive and negative expression, an expansive and a contractive relationship, and that we can relate to any object in the full spectrum of expansiveness and contractiveness. And of course, we know this because, like when we're in half dream sleep and we've had a nightmare and we're terrified and we open up and we see a doll on the dresser, they look like a demon or something because we're looking through the lens of that terror, and it's an unknown humanoid-like shape, and it's a horrible thing, but in the daylight, that's the sweet doll. And so we see that even in short moments, or you have the way that if you're getting to know someone and you haven't yet established a strong correlation with their face and something positive, and they suddenly appear out of the dark, there's a sense of what's going to happen next, and they're terrified of them. And so one of the things that this suggests is that the ego personality or the ego consciousness is operating as a zoom-in lens. So you have the full spectrum of positive and negative probability and possibility here. And then you have the ego with a zoom-in lens occupying a particular part of the probability field and possibility field. So you have the possibility field, then you have the probability field, then you have the actual field. And the actual field is what the ego is paying attention to in that zoom-in lens. And of course, the ego likes pleasure more than pain. And the ego likes a comfortable intensity rather than an uncomfortable intensity. And in both directions, meaning the ego might say that a 5 intensity is comfortable for this experience. I don't want the empty void of nothing. I don't want to feel like there's absolutely nothing I feel at all. And I don't want to feel completely overwhelmed. So, this thing can be mostly nothing, but, overall I want some sense of things happening, that I feel something rather than nothing, that I see something rather than nothing, that I think something rather than nothing, and therefore I exist. Because truly so, if you don't see, touch, taste, anything, mentally, emotionally, or physically, then from a conscious point of view, you don't exist. Because we exist in the interference pattern. And consciousness largely exists in the nexus of multiple dimensional things hitting at a certain point. So consciousness is in some ways a synergy of emotion, of thought, of tactile sensation in the past, in the present, and in the projected future. And when we are aware of these 3, or it's really 6 different dimensions, or is it 9? Because you've got heart, mind, and body in the past, heart, mind, and body in the present, and heart, mind, and body in the projected future. And then you have more than 3 objects. And so it seems like in many ways, and then you have the part that is, the object, and then you have the part that is reacting to the object, and then you have the part that is witnessing the interaction between the parts. And then you have the part that likes the object, and then you have the part that doesn't like the object, and then you have the part that's witnessing that relationship and synthesizing. And you have this triangulation on multiple dimensions, in multiple times, in multiple ways, in multiple intensities. And in the synergy of that, there is the approaching of a sense of a consciousness of that which is between all of this. And so you have literally hundreds of thousands of these triangulations. And if you understand, for example, the structure of an atom, you understand that 99% of what's inside the structure of an atom is space. So you have the electron and I think it's the proton. I have to look up my terms, but you have one small particle rotating around another small particle. And then you have 99% space in between, and that's an atom. And you zoom that up into very large scale, and you have the Earth rotating around the sun, and 99% of all the gap in between is space, and that's a solar system. And so we have these relationships of particles in dance with one another, with space. And when you become aware of enough particles, you start to become conscious of the vast amounts of space that are in between the particles. And it's in that presence of the vast amounts of space between the particles that there is the unknown, the feminine, and the non-verbalized presence. Because you can create 1,000 words around the experience, and all that the 1,000 words around the experience create is a demarcation of the vast amounts of space that exist between the words and that are filled with energy in a wave-like pattern rather than a particle pattern. And so we come back to the basic building blocks, the basic mathematics of the universe, the human experience, the relationship with divinity. You have, certain actions and rituals and things, and then you have what all of these are designed to do. When you pray and put on a robe and light the incense and light the candle and think this thought and say this word and do this, it's all dotting an arena of the psyche with points, with a masculine expression. But the real catalyst, the real transcendence takes place not in the bow, not in the candle lighting, not in the not in the chanting. It takes place in the energy and in the space between those things. You have to define and enact those things in order to create a circle around space. And depending on how you mark them and how you define the circle, determines what is located within the space. Then every space has a positive and negative expression. And so within the space emerges something depending on how we're relating to it. Because again, every object has the full spectrum of possible relationship. And depending on how we relate to it, it is our ally, our friend, or it curses us. Or we curse ourselves. In other words, there's a mathematics that says that when we flow energy into the space in this way, it will come back to us in this way. And if we flow energy into that space in this other way, it'll come back to us in this other way. And so there's a dance between us and the space out of which things emerge. And there's an interference pattern with not only what is there, but what we see of what's there. Now, one of the interesting things to look at if we zoom back is we can see that an energy system like this, as a consciousness, as an ego, we enter the system, we go through its entire spectrum of possibility, and then we exit the system. So we come in as a human being, we exist and find ourselves at one point or another in the entire possibility field of the species. And we as an ego consciousness relate to all of ourselves in the entire relationship with the species. And our relationship is one of fixation or flow, positive or negative charge. So you can have positive, negative charge and it flow, or you can have positive, negative charge, or you can have a let's look at hate, for example. So you come in, and within every object, you're going to have the possibility of experiencing every relationship. So let's say you're flowing, you love the object. You get to know it a little bit more, you hate the object. You get to know it a little bit more, you're bored with the object. You get to know it a little bit more, you're afraid of the object. You get to know it a little bit more, you enjoy about the object. You get to know it more, it's the most important thing. You're fixate, this, that, and the other, and you get to know it a little bit more, and you're sad about the object. So you have this entire cycle, because we're focusing on emotion. So we're looking at the emotional wheel. The same is true physically. It's keeping you alive, it's killing you, it's of no interest, it's pleasuring you. In a possibility field, every single thing has all of these different possibilities. Now, then there's the ego relationship with what's happening. The ego is fine feeling cheerful and positive because the ego is a good spiritual seeker, and so at this point he's going along and flowing. And the ego is fine, feeling some sadness, but then the ego hates the object. Now, there's a particular trajectory of phenomena and environmental variables that will, for any human being, create the emotion of hate within relationship with that object. But the ego doesn't like feeling hate because that's unspiritual. Maybe they're a Buddhist. So nope, we can't feel hate. Well, then they're stuck there because the only way to not feel hate is to stop the flow. Because if you run that energy through that particular algorithm, out comes hate. That's the particular point in the relationship with the object. And if you don't want to feel hate, you've got to dissociate. But when you dissociate, you stop moving. You don't get to move and feel love when you're in the angle of hate. This is part of the color wheel. It's like this is a color wheel. A possibility field is a color wheel. And if you're going around through the red, through the yellow, through this, and you're going in through the various intensities, you're going to go through black. And if black is a bad color, well, you've got to stop moving, because the mathematics of the orbit take you through the entire terrain unless you put on the brakes. Well, if you put on the brakes, now you got to spend lots of energy, and often what you get to know more of is the thing that you break. So if it's not okay to be hateful and you're feeling hate, you're suddenly going to obsess about hate, because, where else that you stopped the flow. You didn't allow it to go through. Oh, I'm a bad person because of hate, and better hide the hate, and I got to hold on to the hate, and hold on to then being separate from it. But separate from what? From the hate. So I'm referencing that. So there's all this, interesting, and it's all centered around this thing where there's a fixation. In this case, a fixation because there's a judgment and it's not okay. So, particularly if you're a Buddhist and being fixated is a bad thing, then you become fixated about not being fixated. And you have a fixation. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm fixated. What am I going to do? And so within the probability field and the possibility field, if you come in and go through an entire flow, in time, you will experience the fullness of the relationship with the object. And it can be empathically, it can, because you've got different lifetimes, you've got different people, but in one way or another, to have the full experience as a human being, you've got to transit through every point of the psyche. And you've got to understand it, and you've got to accept it, or you stop moving. Where you stop moving is where you reside. And if you dissociate from the whole dimension, meaning you become numb emotionally because you can't deal with feeling anger or hate, where you stop moving becomes where you reside. And once you reintegrate and own that part of the human experience again, then you're back where you were. I've met 50, 60, 70-year-old women who've been on hiatus in relationship. They had a trauma when they were 40. They said, that's enough, and no more dating, and so they're celibate and all that, and they go off into the temple and stuff, and it's wonderful, and meditate and feel peaceful, and then they want to start dating 10 years later. And they're expecting that suddenly all that stuff is going to be gone because they've been chanting and this and that and the other. But all that happens is they come right back into the circle where they left off, maybe with a little bit more self-awareness, maybe not, because they've been out of practice. And now they're back in that same domain where they dissociated. It's like they got to this point in the wheel where they felt terrified. And they said, that's not for me. So they dissociate, go off over here, and they come back, and they're in that same terrain. So it's very easy to go quickly back, and they're confused. It's like, well, what's going on here? I thought this and this and this, and so in order to continue the wheel, you've got to be able to flow through the terrain that one's mathematics produces. So this is a possibility field, and within the possibility field, there's a probability field. And within the probability field, there's an actual field. And so the actual field is the one that you experience based on how you position yourself in relationship with all of these objects. And in that sense, you can also see the human set as a play in which every conceivable thing will happen in some version of reality. And the question is, what role are you going to play in the film? So there's going to be someone killed over here. There's going to be someone killing them. There's going to be someone killing them like this. Then there's going to be this other person killing them like that. Then there's going to be this other person being raped. Then there's going to be this other person raping them like this, like that. All the different narratives in the play. And then there's going to be someone abusing this person over here. Then there's going to be someone rescuing the abuser and doing this. And then there's going to be, the full range of expressions. So it's all going to be out there. And the question is, which role do you want to play? Do you want to be the one who comes in and says, what's all this then? You keep your hands off that young woman. Or do you want to be the one who's violating the young woman? Or do you want to be the young woman being violated? Or the young woman gratefully being rescued? Or, which role are you going to play? And within that probability field, certain roles are more fun. So it tends to be that people with more power, people with more freedom, people with the ability and willingness to respond, to pick and choose, pick better roles for themselves. That doesn't mean, if you're part of a dualistic drama, that there will be no negative roles. It just means you're going to pick a better role. And of course, if you're picking a role of someone who's being generous or someone who's being compassionate, that's going to benefit the people around you. If you pick I'm a horrible curmudgeon, whatever, then that's going to make it harder for the people around you. So that's one dimension of this. And yet, regardless of the role that we pick, I'm the Puritan, I'm the this, I'm the that, I'm the spiritual guru, I'm the whatever it is, I don't hurt a fly, I'm saintly, whatever it is, there's going to be a mental and emotional relationship with everyone else in their roles. And where we get stuck is when we cannot accept, for example, our murderous hatred towards the object of the person who rapes our daughter, for example. Our murderous hatred. We can't accept it because that's unspiritual. Like, I'm the one who doesn't harm anyone and this and that and the other. Someone comes and rapes my daughter. And I feel a murderous hatred. But then it's like, oh my gosh, that's not me. I'm not like those other people because I judge them. They need to change, and and I'm okay, and they're bad. And then a part of the cycle of life takes us into that terrain where we've said that's unacceptable, that's bad, those are horrible people. They deserve to be beaten and punished, and then suddenly we're in that phase. It's like, now I'm in that horrible place. And I can't accept it in myself or in them. And I don't know what to do. And so this is where things grind to a halt, and you all the energy backs up and all this force until you find your way through that transition, through that particular judgment, through that particularly narrow place, into an opening to what is. And in that relationship, there is movement, there is life, and there is release from attachment. In other words, you come into this system from the moment you were born, and you don't get to exit this particular possibility field without being able to see and understand all the parts of yourself and all the parts of the other in the whole drama. If there's this one part, it's like, never, I will never, I'm not good like that, and I never will, and da-da-da-da-da, and that's wrong, and this, and that, the other. That's great. But the entirety, you know, in terms, and that's why we have many lifetimes. But the entirety of the release from the program, you know, it's like you enter virtual reality, and the game's over when you can go to any point in the entire reality and not get caught with a fixation, with an obsession that makes it more real than the reality that's outside the game. Because when you get caught, what you're saying is that the place that you're caught is more real than the consciousness that is in the journey. You're saying that the game is more real than who you are as a being. And this is why we tend to experience a lot more grace and fluidity when we're aware to some extent that it's a very, very, very real thing dealing with the rape of a daughter. But is it more real than the divinity and the divine light of the soul that is timeless? Is it more real than that? Well, when we're obsessing, and it's like, yes, 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 we go through that. And then we're born to the other side. There's something bigger. And you don't know and discover that something bigger until you go through it. If you won't go through it, you can't find the something bigger. And so you're stuck there. And so there's you know, this hatred and then you remember the part that's bigger than that hatred and that revenge, and that, you know, you remember the part that's bigger than that. And that part has a bigger sense of self-awareness, a greater sense of consciousness. So in other words, that as with all systems, you go in and it gets tighter and tighter and smaller and smaller and smaller, and you break through and you come out enriched on the other side. It's not quite the same place as the system in which you went in, as with any marriage. You come in, you see the magnificent, the heavenly, the beautiful part in the partner. And you say, well, really? Really? That's it? And you say, oh, this is not what I married at all. I hate this. What's this? You know, this, that, the other. You fucking bitch. You keep moving. Those murderous, well, kill him. You keep moving. And I discover a bigger part of myself. Part of me that is bigger than that pain. A part of me that is bigger than that injury. A part of me, if I can face it. And this is where trauma work is so important, because there are some things that are too big for the individual ego to deal with alone. They flood the lens. You can't deal with something that's this big. You got no context. And that's where you need someone outside of the incident helping to guide you and transit through there. And, you know, in some cultures, there are those guides, and in others, we've killed them all off and told them they're unprofitable. And so they don't exist. This has been fun. I'll see you around.